Hi, Monica Miller here, Legal Director and Senior Counsel for the American Humanist Association. This is Legal Tuesdays, where I answer your questions about separation of church and state that you've asked us on our social media platforms. The first question comes from Jonathan Hine, who says, how can the federal government justify paying clergy salaries when there's no national stay-at-home order? And Alan Kelly asks a similar question, which is, please tell me that there's a challenge in the works for this. So to back up a bit, I think it was the end of March, the federal government passed the CARES Act, which allows for small businesses and nonprofit organizations to get federal loans for payroll and for other disaster-related funding in connection with COVID-19. I think it was the beginning of April, the federal government clarified that faith-based organizations and churches are eligible for this federal funding, and specifically for the Paycheck Protection Program, which covers salaries. Now, the biggest problem with this is that through that program, the government will, in many instances, according to the terms of the statute, will ultimately forgive the entire loan for the nonprofits, and so that will result in a grant, which in turn will result in direct federal taxpayer dollars going to fund clergy salaries without it being repaid. That is unprecedented. I'm not aware of any federal statute or a situation where the government has directly given taxpayer dollars to fund religious activities such as clergy salaries, and the effect of that would absolutely be to violate the separation of church and state within the First Amendment. We are definitely monitoring the situation. It might turn out that those salaries are not going to be deemed eligible. There is a distinction between government funding secular activity, even if it's through a neutral program of general applicability. There was the Trinity Lutheran case I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where the government said, where the Supreme Court said that the government can give out funding to, say, a bunch of nonprofits or schools, including religious ones, if the funding is given on neutral, even-handed terms, and it goes to secular activity or secular structures. So in that case, it was a TANBARK program, I think, or a used tire program that was used in kids' playgrounds. On the other hand, even Trinity Lutheran makes clear that you can't give direct government funding. You can't directly give government funding to support religious activity. You can't give it to support clergy salaries. That goes to the heart of what the First Amendment was intended to prohibit. That is what separation of church and state means. And at sort of its original meaning, the authors of the First Amendment, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, wrote a lot about the problems of giving, churches money. And when the government gives churches money, it comes with strings attached, and it does more violence, I think, to religion and to churches in some ways than it does to the secular world. So, you definitely can't take that money as a religious organization or clergy and not expect there to be strings attached. And I think, it is proper that people are taking alarm at this. Like I said, we're definitely monitoring it. And should it turn out that these clergy salaries are being forgiven, the loans that are being given to churches, if those end up being forgiven, and the end result being federal taxpayer dollars subsidizing clergy salaries and religious activity, our organizations, the AHA, and doubtless many others, will certainly be getting together to figure out how best to challenge that funding. Federal taxpayer standing is not an easy hurdle, and by standing I mean getting into the court to make the challenge, but you can rest assured that we will be among the first at least, to be planning some sort of challenge in that regard. I have time for one other question. Thomas Fairweather on Facebook says, would it be possible to refer to church-state separation as separation of government and religion? Yeah, I think, it's definitely possible. It's accurate. The separation of church and state expression comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists, and as the author of the First Amendment, we do like to quote him and his exact words, because we're often asked or often challenged by the conservative right as to what the original meaning of the First Amendment is. And I think there's no better way to answer them than to point to the author of the First Amendment, one of the two main authors. So with that, I do think, yes, it's absolutely possible, it's accurate, but we just, at least when I write legal briefs, I tend to stick to the original expression. So that's all I have time for today, but I hope everyone stays healthy and safe, and I will see you on the next Legal Tuesdays.